Blog Talk Radio. Welcome to Rainbow Vision Network with host Betsey Lewis.
A radio show reaching beyond the limitations of our minds and beliefs into a world of inspiration and empowerment where the impossible is possible.
Call-ins are welcome at 347-637-2650. Betsey's new book, Mystic Revelations of 13, is now on Amazon, and Angels, Aliens, and Prophecy 2 will be available July 2013. Be sure to visit Betsey's Earth News One blog and calendar of events on her website, betseylewis.com. And now, your host, Betsey.
Welcome, everyone, to the show on this Thursday, July 11th, 2013, and I'm coming to you from southwestern Idaho. Tonight, you are in for a real treat with my special guest, Dr. Ardy Sixkiller Clarke from Montana. And we're going to be talking about her new book, Encounters with Star People. And let me tell you, you're going to be in for some astounding stories of these star people. And I just want to let the listeners know that we won't be taking any live caller questions. But if you have any questions, you can post them on the chat room, and I'll be looking in the chat room to see if you have anything for her. But let me tell you about Dr. Clarke. She's a former professor at Montana State University and an anthropologist who has dedicated her life and career to working with indigenous populations. She has been adopted by enrolled tribal members and given traditional names by 3 Northern Plains spiritual leaders, including the Blackfeet, and it's Women with Great Knowledge is the name. The Northern Cheyenne, Waxhaw Woman, and Lakota Sioux, Woman Who Helps People. And she is also the author of several children's books, including the bestseller Sisters in the Blood, and she continues to work as a consultant to American Indian tribes and indigenous communities worldwide, and is currently working on a second volume of work about the indigenous people of Mexico and the Star People. And she was a guest on Coast to Coast AM on January 27th of this year. So be sure and visit her website. It's www.sixkiller.com. So welcome to the show, Dr. Clarke. Looks like my show.
No, that's me, Beth.
Dr. Clarke, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, good. There you are. Well, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you, Betsy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, well, it's great to have you on the show. It's quite an honor to have you on the show. And I want to let the listeners know, I read your book and couldn't put it down. It was so incredible. These are stories I've never heard before. And, you know, there's so many stories out there and so many people that have claimed that they've had abductions. But tell me, how did a professor at Montana State University get involved with ET stories?
Well, you know, I have to make one correction. I'm not a professor of anthropology. I'm a professor of educational leadership, and I would go out to one of the things that I did at Montana State, in addition to teaching. 30 years ago, it's been longer than that, I went to Montana State as a professor in 1980, and one of my jobs was to try to recruit Native students to come to Montana State University and become teachers and principals and superintendents, because there were very few teachers at that time on Indian reservations who were Native American. And so I would go out and visit the reservations in Montana, North and South Dakota, all over the Northwest region, looking for students who might be interested in coming to Montana State. And at the same time, I was writing grants to the federal government to get scholarships for these students. And as I I visited a reservation, one of the first trips I made on a student recruitment trip, and I met a man. He had set up the meeting for me, and he said to me that night after we had dinner, he said, if you got some time, I'd like to show you something. And so he drove up into the mountains above his village, and he reached over and he pulled a pair of binoculars out of his glove compartment, and he said, come with me. And so I went with him, and we sat on this big boulder overlooking his village, and he said, if we're lucky, they'll come.
Oh.
And I said, well, who will come? And he said, well, the ancestors. He says, sometimes they come and sometimes they don't, but I like to come up here, he said, at night and wait for them. And I had heard similar stories growing up as a child, but, when you grow up and you become an adult, you kind of put the stories of your childhood behind you, and you go on with life. And here I was hearing from this man stories like I had heard when I was a girl. And so I began to think about, how many other people out there had similar stories, how many other tribal groups. And so in my spare time and in informal dinners and visiting with people and going into homes of people, recruiting their students, I frequently would ask them, have any of you ever seen a UFO? And this is how I collected all these stories.
Wow, that's amazing. It was
and
just
the majority of people had never told the stories beyond their family group, and some of them had never even told their family about their encounters. It's just a private thing, and many of them just don't want. Although all the people I talked to said it was all right for me to tell their stories, they did not want the publicity of anyone seeking them out or coming to their reservation or to their area, wherever they lived, and trying to find evidence of UFOs, because that's one of the reasons why they maintain silence, is they just do not want to deal with that.
I know that's so true, Ardy, because I've, spent a lot of time with Native Americans during the 1990s, and I know that they are very private people, and they're very truthful people. And I know in your book you had to use other names so they would remain anonymous, but and I'm sure there are skeptical people out there that say, well, you don't have any evidence, but what do you say to those people that don't believe?
Well, I say to them, I'm not a hard scientist. I'm a social scientist. I'm a person that is interested in the stories of people, and I don't have to have hard evidence to believe that somebody is telling me the truth. I don't have any question whatsoever in my mind. The stories that I presented to the readers in this book are stories that are true. And so, therefore, I just, I don't question it. And, I'm sure I have critics out there, but that's okay, too. Because skeptics are going to be critical of everybody anyway,
Right.
And,
oh, yeah.
And, like in the case of Leland, he was probably the one person, my favorite person, his stories of all the stories that I told. And he was the one that lived in that isolated section of the reservation, and he said that at night this UFO would hover over his property, and it would lower an automobile filled with these people, and he, for lack of a better word, he called them people, and he said. And then they would drive, they would leave leave his property, and then the car would come back in the early morning hours without them. And he firmly believed that they were infiltrating the human population on Earth. For what purpose, he had no idea. But he believed that. And, you know, he took me out in his field. He showed me where the circle was, the burned ground, where nothing would grow, not even weeds would come back. He showed me the car tracks in the you know, through his field. And he didn't even own an automobile. There was never any other automobile on that property. So, you know, there were things of that nature, and his friend corroborated his story because he had seen the same thing happen. So, you know, there were instances of that, but, you know, I listened, I recorded the stories, and I told them as they were told to me.
Oh, amazing stories, just amazing. And, you know, like Dr. John Mack, who was so well known for his you know, interviews and regressions with people that had been abducted. You know, he was, you know, made into, you know, many people were skeptic of what he was doing, cynical of it. And I was wondering, have you heard from any of the academic world about your book? Has anybody said anything to you about it? Or,
not a word.
Not a word.
Not
really?
a word. Not even at MSU. I'm not even sure
really?
they even know that I wrote it. You know, but I donate a portion of the book proceeds to a scholarship fund that I established at Montana State University for American Indian students, and so they'll know that when I give them the first check, I suppose. But other than that, no one has contacted me.
Wow. Well, I think it's a great contribution to ufology literature. I really do, and because these stories are just so amazing. And, you know, we hear about maybe one or two people that have been abducted, you know, and they've written books. But, you know, there's been a recent poll that says close to 8 million people in the United States alone believe that they've had some kind of UFO abduction or encounter. And that's just incredible when you think about it.
Well, and I think it's true. I don't question those people. The interesting thing about, I think, that sets the people that I interviewed, I didn't hypnotize anybody. I don't have those kind of credentials. These were recalled stories that people had. They weren't channeling anything. They weren't under hypnosis. These were recollections of events that occurred in their lives. Now, there were only a couple instances, I think, in the book that I record, abduction kind of situations. The young man that said he went on board and they had cloned him. And this was long before cloning was even known, you know. I mean, he didn't use the word cloned. He said there was a duplicate of me. And that they made him to look exactly like me, and every year they would come for him, and they would make him meet with this duplicate. And once he learned that he was ill and had cancer, they never came for him again. And so he was very, very angry, you know, about that situation because he felt that his cancer was a result of that, you know, of their interference in his life.
That's interesting. You know, we hear so many stories about cloning now, but, you know, isn't it strange that all of us have probably heard that we have an identical twin out there somewhere? I know I have. I've had people say, well, I saw someone that just looked just like you. Do you think that those are ET clones of us?
Well, you know, I don't know about that, but one of the things that I thought was very interesting about him, he said that it didn't matter what they could make somebody to look like him. They could make somebody that could speak like him, but they would never make anybody who had his heart or his soul, because only he knew how to be Indian. And it didn't matter what they did, they wouldn't know how to be Indian.
Well,
and I thought that was an interesting...
That really is.
I thought it was an interesting...
Do you think that all these ET clones out there are, you would think they'd be very robotic, and, you know, people would spot them right away. Wouldn't you think that?
Well, he said this one looked exactly like him. And, you know, I mean, it looked human.
Wow.
So, and he said that, you know, he was being taken on board from the time he was a child. So he watched this clone or this duplicate grow up. And each year they would take him and they would isolate him with this duplicate of him. So he said that he may be able to fool people with his looks, but he'll never have the heart of the Indian. And so if he came here, they would know he was not me.
Right. Wow. That's just
it was
incredible.
An interesting, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I'm finished.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you if you've had any encounters, because a lot of people that write about these things have had encounters.
Well, you know, when I was a little girl, I had an experience. I had grown up in pretty much in poverty, and had we didn't have running water or any kind of bathroom facilities or anything like that, and we had an outhouse, and I had gone to the outhouse. And when I came back from the outhouse, I saw the spacecraft had landed.
Oh, wow.
And I, you know, don't have a whole lot of recollection of what happened. I remember being greeted by an old woman who called me her grandchild, and I thought it was very strange because I knew who my grandmother was, and she wasn't my grandmother. And the next morning, my grandmother says to me, or my mother says to me, "Why were you out so late last night? What were you doing outside last night?" I got up and looked in the bed, and you weren't there. And just as I started to tell her what I had seen, these three boys came up from a neighboring house and said, "Did you see the UFO last night?"
Oh, isn't that something?
And I started to say something, and he reached out and just, you know, indicated to me that I shouldn't talk. And then they went on to describe it, the lights and everything. And that was my first encounter. And but I don't know if that is what really, you know, growing up hearing the stories of the Star People was also, you know, probably influenced me more, I think, in searching out other people. I think when I met this man here in Montana who told me this story, it was like a revelation that there were more of us than just me, you know, that there were other people who had similar experiences. And so that piqued my curiosity. And so basically I went in search of those people.
Well, it sounds like you had some missing time with that experience.
I could very well have, yeah.
I think so. And it sounds like it's no accident that you have decided to write about these stories. It sounds like it was all planned, I would think, since you were a child. So, you know, like I said, there's just no accidents. I wanted to ask you about your interesting cover. There is a medicine wheel on the front, which is really beautiful. Is that an actual photo of a medicine wheel?
Yes, it is. That's the medicine wheel in Wyoming. It's up in the mountains in Wyoming, in northeastern Wyoming. I think that's where where it came from. It used to be that you could go there and there was no fence around it, and now you can see there is a fence around it.
Right. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, but I think the publisher.
I was just going to ask you. Go ahead.
Well, I think the publisher.
Go ahead.
Well, I think he chose a picture or took a picture or something. That's what it looks like to me.
Oh, it's beautiful. It really is beautiful. I love that photo. And what I was thinking that, when I think of medicine wheels like that, I wonder if those are patterned after UFOs, these flying saucers. Do you think that could be?
Well, I couldn't speak to that because my understanding of the medicine wheel is, that it's, it's spiritual in nature and has to do with the circle of life, but who knows what's been lost in the translations over the centuries,
Mhm. Now, star people, that goes way back with your people and most tribal people, indigenous people, talk about the star people, and that's really not unusual. They take it in stride, not like us who, are shocked to hear these stories or fearful of it. And I was wondering what how far back does that go in Native American culture?
Well, I think from the beginning of time, because a lot of the stories, they will say in the beginning of time, or, that there lived on Earth the star people and the sun people, or the star people came from the stars, and lived among the Earth people. So a lot of the different tribal groups or indigenous groups throughout the world have similar stories. In Mexico and Central America, you'll hear about the sky gods. The same thing in Peru. You'll hear about the sky gods who came and who lived. And in some of the villages in Mexico, I actually came across stories of sky gods that came to Earth on a beam of light and stood in the village and then stayed there and terraformed the land. They changed rivers. They taught people how to farm, and they lived among them. They married. In one village, there's a story of the sky god who married a Maya woman, or a Zapotec woman, actually. This was a Zapotec village, and she bore a son to him, and when the son became a grown man, he went back to the village and he stood on the rock, and a beam of light came down and took him away, and he was never seen again, and his son became the ruler of the village. So there are a lot of stories like that you find throughout indigenous populations.
And these have been handed down generation to generation.
From generation to generation. In fact, it's really interesting because I came upon this Zapotec village, and just along the side of the road was the remains of a pyramid. And then when I go there, I stop, and when I go up, the story is written out about what happened here. And then that's when I went out and started talking to the locals about it, and getting as much information as they knew, And so there's several. I found another village up in the Chiapas where the same thing happened, that a god came from the sky and stayed for, I think it was 3 days and 3 nights. He stood in the village, and then he began to talk, and the people were frightened of him. But, he did such miraculous things, and so they considered him a god, and they built this great temple for him. So it's really interesting when you get out and, because for so long those stories were ignored or regarded as myths rather than that they were nothing more than stories told to entertain children. And so all of that knowledge was ignored. And today, if you go out there and you listen to the people and they talk about these things, it's really interesting. And, one of the things that many of the Maya told me is that, yes, the people from the stars came, but they never left. That's who we are. We are the people from the stars. And so I find that very interesting, too.
Oh, it really is. It's amazing. Now, I know that most of the West and Southwest has been a real hot spot for UFO sightings.
Right.
And, it seems like Native Americans watch the skies. I've spent some time in the Southwest, and I know that, it's so clear and the skies are so clear that they must, and the reservations down there, they must watch the skies a lot. But I was thinking about the big event over Phoenix, Arizona, which was on March 13th, 1997. And I had Dr. Lynn Kaiti on my show, who wrote a book about the Phoenix Lights. And she said that Native Americans down there have talked about the star people for ages, that they just kind of laugh at us because we get all excited about it, but they are quite aware of what's going on out there, and they see it all the time.
Well, and I think that's true, and I asked this one elder, I said, why is it that you think we see the UFOs, or we have these encounters, and other people do not? And he said, because we still look at the sky. We're not sitting in our houses looking at computers and playing games and watching television. We're still out here looking at the sky. And so I think there's a lot of truth to that.
I think so, too, absolutely. I hear this.
I can remember as a child, that's what you did at night. You sat out and you watched the sky.
Sure. I remember
watch.
having slumber parties, and you looked up at the sky at night. We'd tell ghost stories and look at the sky at night.
Yeah, that's just what you did. And now that's all lost.
Sure.
And you could name every constellation. From the time you were little, you knew, where the Big Dipper was and where the North Star was and where Sirius was. It was just a part of your childhood. But today, you ask young people today, and they aren't aware of those things.
No, they aren't. They aren't at all. You're so right about that. Now, I understand that you've collected over 1,000 stories. How did you decide which ones to put in? Really? That's incredible.
Yeah, close to 1,000. It was really difficult to choose the ones that I put in my book. One of the things I wanted to do was to make sure that the stories that I chose were stories that probably had never even been told, that nothing similar was out there. I wanted the uniqueness of the stories, because how many times have we read about I was taken aboard a ship and I was examined and they did this to me and they did that to me, and then I wake up 3 hours later and I'm standing in front of my house. Well, I got those kind of stories, but I just chose not to write about them because I felt that the public needed to know that there were a lot of experiences that were going on out there that were so unique and so different, and that like there are, according to one of my elders who I interviewed, he said that there are different races out there and that they have different agendas. And I thought it was, that people needed to know that. That's why I believe you have people having different experiences. Why some people have positive experiences and other people have negative experiences. One of the things I never encountered in all of the United States, of the American Indian tribes in the United States and the Alaska Natives, I never encountered any records of alien babies, impregnating females, or raping men. But one of the things, but I have encountered that south of the border. In Mexico, it was a common theme that ran throughout, of women being abducted and getting impregnated and having babies. Now, I don't know if it's a cultural thing or if indeed those experiences and the star people or aliens or whatever you want to call them who are visiting that region of the world are a different group of aliens than what is visiting with American Indian tribes.
That's interesting. You know, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos of some of these UFOs that have been captured over Mexico City and some of those places, and it's just amazing what's going on. There's so much going on, and some of them are just so strange that they've actually seen people up in the sky that look like people or maybe witch-like, and just really bizarre things in Mexico.
Well, you know, when you get out into some of the native villages and where the people, you know, Mexico doesn't, if you get into the native Mayan villages, I mean, people still don't have, in a lot of those villages, they don't have any of the modern conveniences. They're living in the small traditional huts. They are growing their corn and their peppers, and, you know, in their backyard they'll have fruit trees, and they may have some pigs and chickens, but they live a subsistence life. Every day you will see the women, you know, processing the corn and going and in a lot of the little villages they have these little they're just storefront they have a machine that makes tortillas, and a lot of the younger women, you'll see them walking with their corn, and they will take their corn there, and they will make their tortillas on the machines. And the older women still are making them by hand. But the younger women are going to these because they can produce these machines, you know, these tortillas, and they'll make hundreds of them for the day to feed their families. And they haven't seen television. They haven't, you know, they don't have cell phones. They don't have any of the modern conveniences. So they aren't influenced by pop culture. And so, you know, one of the descriptions that I got repeatedly from people who had experienced UFOs in these small villages would be that they one landed that looked like a gasoline tank.
Oh,
now, what
wow.
they have seen, a gasoline tank, you know, those big oval or elongated gasoline-powered, that they move gas in, you know, from the...
Right.
And they think, and, you know, that would be like the cigar-shaped UFOs.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And they're cylinders, and so they see that, and the only way they can describe it to you is that it looks like a big gasoline tank landing. And I had several people tell me that, you know, describe it in that manner. And so you know what they've seen, they're trying to put in their own words and in their own worldview what they are familiar with, you know, stories about these UFOs. And, you know, for me, that is honesty, you know, when you have people who are trying to make sense of what they saw by relating it back in descriptive terms to something that they are familiar with. So they haven't seen, you know, Independence Day or any of those films that, you know, show the UFOs. You know, what they see is a tanker going down the road, you know. And and then, you know, I had one man tell me that, you know, he was out gathering firewood, and all of a sudden this light came from overhead, and he thought it was God, and so he fell to his knees, and he's praying, and then out of the darkness came these three beings and he said that from then on he had no memory. Well, the next day he's out gathering firewood again, and a friend says, well, I'm surprised to see you here, and he tells him that he saw him being taken on a river of light up to the sky, and he thought he would never see him again. So they're interesting kinds of descriptions that, you know, that I find very exciting, you know, as I'm writing and you know, putting all this together. So I think the readers will be very very happy with the second book as well, you know.
Because
I think so too. I'm trying to choose stories that, again, are unique to ufology.
Well, they're really mind-blowing. Let's get into some of the stories because they're just incredible stories. I like the story about Harrison and his grandfather. and about the spaceship that crashed in, I believe, 1945, right?
Right. He tells of he was a boy at the time. His grandfather lived in a very isolated section of the reservation, and I've been there, and I can attest to the fact that it is a very isolated area. No neighbors within, I would say, probably 10 miles of where he lived. His grandfather reported his parents worked for the tribe, and so in the summer times when he wasn't in school, they would send him out to his grandfather's place. And his grandfather owned this remote ranch out in the country, and so they would send him out there for the summer to stay with his grandfather, and at the same time his grandfather was teaching him how to be a cowboy and rancher and all about Indian traditions and everything. And he arrived on the ranch this one summer, and his grandfather told him about the UFO that had crashed on his property, and about the individuals that were in this craft that survived. And he wasn't sure if any of them had died, but there were more seats on this structure than were on the survivors. And so they actually lived there until they were rescued. And he prided himself in protecting them so that no one else knew that they were that this spacecraft had landed. And at the time that his grandfather lived there was actually another neighbor just a few miles away, I think maybe a mile or two away, but they weren't there at the time that this event had occurred, so they never came around. So in fact, he was fairly, had no contact with anybody from the outside. And he described things like they wore suits that didn't get wet, and he wanted one of those. He talked about how they could appear and disappear at will. How he went hunting, and he took them food, and they told him that they didn't eat food like humans ate food. Just a lot of interesting kinds of events that happened, that his encounter and interaction with them. They told him that they were an exploration party, and that they had to wait there until they were rescued. There was no way they could repair their ship and take it with them, but it was very well camouflaged and hidden inside this butte because it had gone in and only part of it was even visible. And then they had camouflaged that part. But then when the Corps of Engineers came in and were building a dam on this river where they had crashed, his grandfather thought that the government had uncovered this craft and had taken it away. And I was talking to him about that. I said, "Don't you think somebody would have seen it?" And he said, "You've got to remember, this was the late 1940s and early 50s, and on the reservation there were very few automobiles." He said when they brought the heavy equipment in, the people would get out and stand and watch these big machines go by because they had never seen anything like that. He said they wouldn't know. Anything could have been moved on this reservation and nobody would have known. And he said, and he was convinced, the grandfather was convinced that they had found it and had taken it.
Interesting. I bet they did.
Yeah, a very interesting
like
story.
What I found also really fascinating was that many of the people that you interviewed talked about aliens that looked very human-like instead of the small grays. I know you talk about those, but in this case, he talked about an alien that looked, I think, was over 7 foot tall, right?
Right. The other thing I thought was interesting is that he said that his grandfather, there was a picture in a Bible of an angel. And he said that his grandfather told him one time, he said, they looked a lot like this. And the angel, he said, was kind of glowing in the photo. And he said they looked a lot like this, only they didn't have wings, he said. And so, I think there might have been a luminescent quality about them, but I'm not sure. And he wasn't sure either, what his grandfather was alluding to. But they definitely were white, light-skinned, very light-skinned.
What else I found was just incredible. Talk about when Harrison went into the ship. He sat in one of the chairs, and tell him what happened.
Yes, and he said it embraced him.
Yeah,
and he was very frightened because he didn't think he would be able to get out of it. And then all he had to do was think about getting out of it, and the chair released him. And so then he kept doing it over and over again, he said. And he found these things like jars in this one area, and he showed it to his grandfather, and his grandfather made him put it back, and he told him it was sacred, that he wanted to take it. His grandfather said it was the food of the star people, and that he shouldn't mess with that stuff, that he shouldn't go and do that. And, of course, he said this was in the day when kids listened to their grandparents, so he did what he was told, and he said probably today kids would be eating it.
Right. It sounds like the whole ship was organic and had an intelligence of its own, though.
Right,
the way,
it did.
Yeah, he described it. And
it was really
I was just going to say, he also said that they were from the Taurus constellation.
Right.
Did they actually tell him that they were from that constellation?
No, his grandfather told him, pointed to the stars that they had told him this is where we're from. And so his grandfather had pointed that out to him. So he goes to school, and he finds an old astronomy book, he said, and was able to locate that constellation. So, and his teacher helped him, and he said they found out it was the Taurus constellation.
Now, did they ever tell him why they were here?
That they were an exploratory group, a team. Yeah, which is what a number of the people told me, that they were not here to interfere with the people of Earth, the life on Earth. They were only here to observe and to, and so, I found that really interesting. That doctrine, they talked about a doctrine of non-interference. That if they, if their intent was not to interfere, and the one man, the one that had the alien heart. Do you remember that story?
Yes, I love that story. Yes,
the one with it was a petrified heart, and he pointed out to me how different it was from a regular heart, and he said this is the heart of an alien, and it was been passed on for several generations through his family. And he was saying that he had been told that there was something like a universal law that those who visited here were not to interfere, and that there were rogue races that were interfering, because he had asked them about the stories of abduction, and they told him we are not the group that do that, and those people are violating. But apparently, so there was a distinction made there that this group who are doing these things are not it's not endorsed by the other races that are out there.
It sounds like there's a whole lot of aliens out there visiting us, and we think we're alone out here, in the solar system.
I think we're far from alone.
I know. When you think about probably millions, billions, trillions, how many solar systems there might be out there that harbor life and who might be visiting us, it's just mind-boggling, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I just read this morning that they have found a planet that's blue like the Earth. from a distance. When they look at it, it looks like Earth, and it likely sustains life.
Wow, isn't that something? Now,
but there were those who there are some stories in there of aliens who abducted. Remember the two young men, the teachers and coaches that were taken on board a spacecraft, and they said the creatures were almost insect-like.
Yes, right.
So there are, a lot of, and that, and then I was telling you about the backward walking people. There's when I was in Belize, my driver and guide came to meet me, and when I arrived in the city, and he says to me, would you like a tour of the city? Well, I didn't know that my tour of the city was going to be going to a wedding celebration. And that's what happened, is that he had to be at this wedding celebration of his cousin, or he felt he had to be, but at the same time he had a responsibility to take me around the city. And so what I end up doing, I go meet his family, I meet his parents, I meet his in-laws, I go to this wedding, and here I am among all these people. And I had told him, one of the things I was doing was I was collecting stories. I was looking for indigenous stories of sky people, sky gods, and all this. And so he's telling all of these relatives sitting around this table, and this woman, his cousin, leans over to me and says, well, I have a story for you. I'll tell you about the backward walking people. And she says we always see them in connection with a spaceship. And so she begins to tell me the story. And a lot of the stories I collect happen that way. Is somebody will hear something, somebody will say, well, she collects UFO stories. And, on the reservations, people say, oh, you're the UFO lady, right?
I love that.
Yeah, you're the UFO lady who collects all these stories. Well, and I had never intended to write the book. I retired from Montana State University 6 years ago, and I had been contacted to come out of retirement and to work with a tribe in South Dakota, evaluating a $5 million grant that the federal government had given to a tribe. And so I went back to Washington, D.C., and I went through the training of what the government expected the evaluators to do. And then I went down to the reservation, and I spent several days down there. And I was with a group of women one day at lunch, and I don't know how the subject of UFOs came up, but it did come up. And I started telling them some of the stories I had collected over the years. And this one woman looked at me, and she said, what are you going to do with those stories? And I said, well, probably nothing. And she said, so when you pass, all of this information is going to be lost.
That's
and
right.
I said, yeah, I'm sure nobody's going to want it. And she said, what you need to do is to write a book, because that's knowledge that no one knows, and that's part of our heritage.
It is.
And so on the way back home to Montana, I'm thinking, do I really want to take this job and commit for the next 5 years of my life to spending a lot of time in South Dakota, or do I want to write a book? And so, you know what I decided?
You wrote a book.
I wrote a book, yeah, and they got another evaluator. Huh?
Well, we're glad you did. It's wonderful you did. Now, I know that in one of your stories, it talks about that there are violent alien races out there, and we happen to be one of them, right?
Do what? I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
How many violent races did they say, that are maybe not great? I think we're one of them, right?
Right, we're one of the violent races in the universe, right.
Yeah,
it's kind of sad to think about that, isn't it?
I know. Yeah, they talked about, I think, 4, so we're
right.
We're one of the.
Well, and the sad part of it is, we're such a warlike people,
Mm-hmm. We are.
And I think that's why they put us in that violent group, and look what we do to one another.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If I was coming onto this planet, I just keep going. Why stop? Just keep going.
That's probably the reason why they observe us and don't interact with us.
Mm-hmm, right. Now, but there has been some ETs that broke the law, the galactic law out there, right?
Right.
Talk about
well,
some of those.
And it's kind of interesting because, it happens by accident. One of the stories I recall is the man who would go out into the desert to pray. And he had gone out and he had set up a camp, was sitting there drinking coffee, or tea maybe, I can't remember right now. But anyway, this alien comes into his camp, and he thinks it's one of the neighborhood boys and doesn't even look around, and then realizes that it is a starman, and he invites him into his camp. And the starman basically is so cold from being out in that desert, and that cold desert air at night, mm-hmm. and tells him that, where he comes from, that they don't have this kind of weather, and he is like a botanist from his world, and he's collecting samples, and he says his people had been doing it for generations, had been coming to the same spot, collecting the same data over and over again to compare it, and so he puts a blanket around this. And so these are, but this was an accidental kind of thing, and the starman tells him that he's not supposed to be doing this, and he would be severely reprimanded had, if his superiors found out what he was doing, because they weren't supposed to make contact.
Isn't that interesting? Wow.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so many out there, and there's just so many myths and everything, and I don't think they're myths either, because legend and myths come from something, from truth, I think. And like
one of the most interesting characters I met was Chauncey, who claimed, that the alien was trying to steal his dog.
Oh,
and,
right.
And they called him the man who shot an alien. And his granddaughter had told me about him. She was one of my students here at Montana State, and she told me about him, and she invited me up to see him because I had sent him a gift of a poster, and so she invited me. He said, if you're ever up on the reservation, to make sure that university lady comes see me. So I go up and I get the food I know that he likes. I got information from her about what treats he liked and stuff, and so I take it out to his place in the country, and when I arrive, he's on his property shooting gophers, and so he's carrying his gun. He comes around the corner of the house with his gun, and he says, "You must be that university lady, right?" and he's got this gun, and he's just blasting gophers all over the place, and so then when we sit down to talk, he tells me that he didn't actually shoot an alien. He just shot at him, and on purpose. And then he takes me around and he explains to me that in the middle of the night, his dog just started. He called his dog Blue Sun, and S-O-N, like it was his child. And he said that he heard this. Blue Sun started just barking and scratching at the door. So he opened the door, and the dog was gone before he could get out with him. And he went around the side of the house, and he was howling, and then all of a sudden, silence. So he grabs his gun, and around the house he goes. And when he gets around the house, he sees this human-like form standing over his dog. And so he shoots at it. He thinks that somebody is trying to hurt his dog. And then he describes this character as like wearing this glowing suit that looks like pajamas. He said it looks like baby pajamas with feet in it, he said. And he can't imagine what any grown person is doing out there dressed like that. And then he comes to understand that it is someone from the stars. So he asked him how he got there, and he said, well, he had his ship was behind the buttes. So he walks with him, and as he's walking, he's got his dog, and he's telling his dog to heel, and he gets a stick, and the dog retrieves it, and just a number of things are going on. And the alien becomes very interested in how he can tell this dog what to do, and this dog will do it. And obviously, the dog has intelligence beyond that of what perhaps this alien was familiar with in those if they had animal creatures on his planet, I don't know. But anyway, when he gets to the spacecraft, and he said it was a very small craft, and he explains to him that there's something else. He called it a base ship. And I think we call them motherships, but he called them a base ship where he would fly to. And so he says that the alien wanted his dog. And he said, I just took my gun and I just laid it across my arms, and he got the message. So I said to him, well, do you think the alien was friendly? And he said, well, how can he be friendly if he tries to steal a man's dog? No, I don't think he was friendly. And he said, and he keeps coming back, he said. They come by here all the time, and I know they're after my dog. They want my dog. And so I would go see him every time I went to the reservation. And I just, I'd stay over a weekend and go on Saturday so I could drive out there to see him. He was such a wonderful man. And so this one day I get a call. I'd known him a couple of years, and I get a call from his granddaughter who had graduated and was now back on the reservation, and she was teaching. And she said, Grandpa died. And she said, I just want to let you know. And so I went to the funeral, and they had at this where they had buried him. He had a family plot, and they had gotten permission to allow him to be buried with his wife and children who had preceded him in death. And I went out back after the service was over, and everybody was getting in their cars and leaving, and this dog was lying on this grave. It was just like he was mourning. And I got down on my knees, and I was holding this dog, and I could just feel the pain. And so I go to his granddaughter, and I said, I'm really concerned about this dog. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. She said, he's just mourning. She said, my kids just love Blue. She says, we'll come back and we'll get him tomorrow. She said, we'll let him mourn tonight, and then we'll come back and we'll get him tomorrow. All the way home, I'm thinking about this dog. I am so worried about this dog, because I have a dog that I feel like is my baby too,
Right,
and so
me too.
I wasn't back on the reservation. It was right before Christmas. I was up there, and I was looking, to see if students to come the next semester to the university, and I saw her when I drove by the school, and she was out in the playground with the kids, and so I stopped and I went in and was talking to her, and I said, well, tell me about Blue. And she said, we never found him.
Wow.
She said he was gone. She said we went back and we looked and we called and we got horses and we rode over the plains and we looked and looked and we never found him again. And so, in my way of thinking, those aliens got Blue. That star man came back and he took Blue. So I said, from then on, I wasn't about to let my little dog out of my sight. And my friends would tease me and they'd say, oh, you're such an overprotective mother. But I said, I know if Chauncey was looking down on me, he would approve of what I was doing.
Oh,
But that was one of the most touching stories, and then of course Leland, who changed the flat tire on that car and got those silver dollars.
Yeah.
And then he gave me one of the silver dollars. Some of the stories from the elders were so touching and so vivid and so wonderful, that stories that people, they're just unheard of encounters.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, I chose those to include in the book.
Gertie, Ardy, would you talk about Gertie, which is a great story because she said her father was an alien.
Right, and my uncle introduced me to her. He was a retired military man, had spent his life in the Air Force, and I had gone to visit him, gone back to my home country, and I'd gone to visit him down in Alabama, and he knew that when we were kids, we both heard the same stories, and so he knew that I had an interest, and I told him I had been collecting stories, and he said, well, I have this friend I want you to meet. And so he took me, and Gertie lived on a riverboat, and so he took me to see her, and she started to tell me the story about how her mother actually found, she was working in a factory, and had found this man, in an alleyway, and he was freezing to death, and so she took him home with her. She was a single girl just working and had an apartment. Took him home, and he proceeds to tell her that his spacecraft had landed in the ocean, or not in the ocean, in a lake. And so she ended up, he was stranded, and so he ended up staying, and they got married, and she got him a job at the factory. And I guess in those days, nobody asked for Social Security numbers or anything. You could just do anything, And so he worked in this factory with her. And I thought the interesting thing about her story was, so she said her father was an alien, and that her mother, so she would say, she would tell people that she was half alien, she was half black, she was half Indian, it was just an interesting story that she had to tell. But her father apparently was very mechanical, he could fix anything. He gave up on the fact that when Roswell happened, he thought that the people had come to rescue him. And that did not happen, of course. And so he just kind of gave up on the idea that he was ever going to be rescued. And he eventually passed away. But she said that she was convinced that she was part alien. And when my uncle died, I saw her at the funeral. And she stood off from the rest of the group, and she was a very commanding figure, beautiful woman. And so I looked for her, and she never came to the reception. So I went back to Montgomery several times, trying, to settle my uncle's estate, and here she was. I looked for her and couldn't find her, and then one day I met this old man on the river, and he said, "I know who you're talking about." He said he described her as that woman who he thought she was very strange because she kept a blanket wrapped around her. He said even when it was 100 degrees. He'd never seen anybody do that before. But remember, her dad was always cold. And then I thought about how the alien that came upon the man that in the campfire and how he was always cold.
Cold, yeah,
and,
right.
I thought, gee, is there a connection there, coming from a planet where there is no cold, and then they come here and they suffer if they get into the cold.
Now, didn't you say that she didn't seem to age either?
Yes, she didn't. She didn't seem to age at all.
Wow. And she just disappeared, right?
Just disappeared. Wow. So nobody knew her, And so it was really, some interesting characters I met during this time and stories that unfolded.
Oh, I love them. You know, and what really stood out for me is the stories of people being taken aboard craft and seeing other Native American people on board.
Right.
And what really grabs me is I've heard many, many stories of people being abducted en masse with others. And, you know, it kind of makes me wonder, because when I was in Tucson a few years ago, I was living there, and I would walk down the street and I would see somebody, and I'd swear I'd met them before, I'd seen them before. And I kind of wonder, when all of us start having this feeling that we've met someone, maybe we have on board a UFO.
Well, you know, I had one man, and I didn't include that in the book, but I probably am going to include it in the second book I'm writing. But he told me he met his wife on a UFO. And he said they were both children. And he described how she was dressed. And he said the moment he saw her, he fell in love with her, and he wanted to help her. And he talked about this dress. And he said 20 years later, he is invited to this party, and he walks in the door, and there is this woman, and he knows it's the girl that he saw on his spacecraft. And she thinks he's crazy. She just laughs at him and says, I've never been abducted. I don't know what you're talking about. You're some crazy man coming around here. And so he said later, you know, I mean, he dated her for a couple of years, and she took him. She was going through some things she had in an old cedar chest, and there was the dress. The dress he had seen her in that night. And so he says, I always tell people, I met my wife on a spaceship.
Well, it makes you wonder if some of these, you know, partnerships and things with people are planned by the extraterrestrials, and what agenda they have.
Well, I thought it was quite an interesting story. You know, he said she was never a believer until, you know, and there was that dress, and he said, you know, he firmly believed he met her on a spaceship.
Wow.
And I had another man tell me he saw his cousin on a UFO when he was taken aboard.
Have you ever had that feeling that when you meet someone for the first time that you've seen them before, you know them?
Absolutely, or I've met them before.
Yeah. Right.
I was at a meeting last night. I was at a meeting last night, and a woman sat across from me, and I kept saying, where have I met you? And she didn't act like she recognized me at all. She gave me no indication that we had ever met before. And when we left there, I told my husband, I said, you know, I just cannot figure out where I have seen that woman before. But I know I have seen her and talked to her, you know? So it was a very strange feeling. Yeah.
I bet. Now,
you know, because
some of these cases talk about cattle mutilations, or one case
the
was
police
a buffalo
officer,
carcass.
The police officer and his wife who came upon the cattle mutilation and then saw the UFO, and then lost like 3 or 4 hours of time, and didn't realize it until they arrived at their destination, and then went back and he realized his weapon was missing, and he goes back looking for it, and he finds it, and it's melted and had been thrown over the side of the hill. He actually showed me the weapon. But, you know, I had one person say, well, why didn't you take pictures of it? Well, you know, this was before the age of digital cameras. You know, I mean, they didn't have, you know, digital camera or a telephone to snap a picture. You know, it's just, you know. But
people forget that, don't they?
Well, the other thing is too is sometimes when you see these things, they are so, you get so excited and you're so bewildered and confused and startled by what you see. You don't think of grabbing a camera. I think people forget that. Is that you're so much into what you're seeing that you really don't think about those things.
No, that's true. Before I let you go, I wanted you to talk about Black Elk because he was such a famous Heyoka or medicine man who died in 1950, and he had some very powerful visions of the future. Talk about it, because I never heard about the UFO encounter and everything with him. Talk about that.
Well, he was a young man when that happened, and it is a true story that he was in a sweat lodge, and he was at his cousin's house, and a UFO appeared over the sweat lodge, and his family was there, cousins and people that he was. The sweat lodge was there on his family's place, and they got so excited and had actually called the police. And by the time, of course, the police got there, they weren't there. But while he was in that sweat lodge, and he could hear the commotion outside, but he had reported that he couldn't come out because he had to complete the ceremony. But a stone came flying through the sweat lodge and landed between his feet. And he carried that stone for the rest of his life. And he always said that, it was his connection with the stars, that when he always would say that when he smoked his pipe was to communicate with the star people.
Isn't that interesting? And you just don't hear these stories when you read about Black Elk. That's just not something you hear about or read about.
Well, and I heard it from somebody who knew the family, and who told me the story, and he said, it was something that Black Elk always kept with him. It was part, even after he converted to Christianity, which he did. He continued to practice the traditional ways and carried that with him as part of his medicine bag.
Right. Now, I understand that you received something that was supposed to have been held by ETs. Can you talk about that?
A silver dollar.
Now, wasn't there something else, though? Wasn't there a rock or something that you were given?
No, I was given a silver dollar.
Silver dollar. Okay, I was thinking it was a rock. Maybe I was just thinking of something else. But
and I was given
a
bracelet that somebody made that showed the story of the alien that he met. And one of the things I thought was interesting about it is the alien head in the picture has red eyes, and he used rubies. And he said, he told me when he gave me the bracelet, he said, there are a lot of people out there that say the aliens have big black eyes, but my alien had red eyes. And I heard that more than once.
I've heard that too.
Yeah, I heard that more than once.
Sure.
So and then I heard, the other interesting thing, I think, and sometimes, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is that a lot of the people told me stories that they were wearing these big goggles. You know how you have these stories about these big black eyes? Maybe they are goggles.
Right. That's what I wanted to do.
Yeah. So that I thought was an interesting perception on the part of some of the people that I interviewed, is that they were wearing these big goggles.
Do you think there are star people living underground on our planet now?
Well, I think there is a strong possibility that there are bases underground, yes.
There's so many stories
I don't know
about...
if they live there. I don't know if they live there, but I think they might have bases there, where they can land and where they can go about their business unseen, and I think there is some evidence that the government that they are cooperating with governments, and I just don't think the American government. I think it's governments around the world.
Oh, I agree.
I mean, why would they choose us? Why would they
totally
choose?
Yeah.
So I think. I do think some of that might be going on. Because, you just think back in history. Where in the world did the transistor radio come from? Just out of the blue. All of a sudden we have a transistor radio.
Sure.
Do you remember that?
So many things that just came out of the blue.
Out of the blue,
the
and
technology.
And where did it come? I just think that there's some of that's going on, and that we're just kept in the dark.
I
think the more these stories come out, and the more people realize what's really going on, the better off we are.
I think so too. More and more people are coming out. There's more stories that are coming out, and just recently, I don't know if this is real, I saw it on YouTube, but a former CIA agent who was dying said that he knew that the military was involved. He saw these aliens, and he knew what was going on at Area 51. So I think more and more people are going to start coming out and telling the truth. It's about time, too.
Well, so many people were threatened and were so afraid of what the government could do to them. And so over time, they expected all this information, all this stuff to go away. But it hasn't gone away at all. And
it hasn't, and it won't.
No, I don't think it will. And there are a lot of people who think, well, this is just nonsense, somebody's just telling stories. But I don't believe that the people who talked with me were telling any fictional stories. I walked with those people. I listened to those people. And I believe them.
I do too.
And I think your readers will too I think your listeners, if they read the book, they will believe too.
Oh yes, I know that.
I get letters after letters from people who have read the book, who write to me, and many of them ask more questions.
Sure.
And others want to tell me their experiences, and I answer every letter. And
do you? Bless you.
Oh yes, and some of them I get several letters from. I had a young man from Japan write me and said he read my book, and he was so impressed. Well, I don't know if he's a young man or not, but anyway, he was so impressed with it that he decided to find a publisher for it in Japan. Because he wanted the Japanese people to know. And I just signed a contract for that book to be published in Japan.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And so, there are people all over the world. I mean, I get letters from Australia and Italy and Scandinavian countries. Yeah. So,
it's a wonderful book.
And so it's really, grown in interest around the world.
Oh, sure. Oh, I can imagine. And you've got another book coming out. When is that coming out?
Well, I think it probably won't be out until January or February. It takes a while once you get the book written to go through the process of editing and then, on for publication. So it probably won't be out until January or February. The temporary working title will be something like Encounters with Sky Gods and Star People, probably more stories from more untold stories from the indigenous people of the Americas. Because I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to include stories from Central America and Mexico, Peru, and possibly more stories from the Northwest Territories up in Canada and Alaska, and some from the United States. So it'll just be the indigenous.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And so that's what I'm looking at right now.
I'd love to get you back on the show again when your
I'd love to be back, and
book is out. And,
I will let you know. I'll keep you I'll keep you posted. Okay.
And tell me, before I let you go, what do you think their agenda is? Do you think they have...
I don't know if they do have an agenda. I think that because there are so many races with different purposes for coming here or visiting here, that I don't think there is a united purpose. If there is a purpose, the people I've interviewed haven't been told that. You'll read stories where they say, well, they are here monitoring our nuclear, whatever. They're here to make sure that we don't take violence into outer space or take our wars out there, or they're here to save us. If we try to destroy ourselves, they're going to come and save us. Well, none of the people I interviewed were told those kind of things.
Interesting.
So,
wow.
I'm not sure where that stuff is coming from, because the people I talked to were not told of any specific agenda.
Wow. Well, that's interesting, because so many abductees claim that they were told what was going to happen, that something catastrophic is going to happen to the world, and we hear all these different stories, so it's really interesting to know that you haven't come across that yet.
Not at all. And I think it's kind of interesting. One of the things, it's the same thing as 2012. You have people who take the apocalypse from the Bible, and they take a Mayan calendar that was no way near the end of the world prediction, and they combine it all together with different legends and stuff and decide that the end of the world is coming in December 21st, 2012. And they kind of make up their own. And think of the millions of dollars that people made just writing books about that.
Right, exactly.
Because, people are so vulnerable because they want to know what the future is. We aren't happy with living in the here and now. We want to know, am I going to get rich? Am I going to die tomorrow? Or and none of the star people that the people I interviewed met had any predictions of the future.
Right. Wow. Now, where can people buy your book? On Amazon or?
They can buy it on Amazon, and they can buy it at Barnes & Noble. They can buy it at any online retailer, and a lot of bookstores carry it. I think, and they can go online and they can, at Amazon, and they can look at the chapters, see the titles of the chapters, and read a chapter or two. And they can also read reviews by people who've read it. I think there are quite a few reviews there.
Oh, I've got to put one on there. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Well, thank you.
Well, it's been a great show, and I want to remind everyone to go to Dr. Clarke's website. Excuse me, I'm starting to lose my voice here. And that's www.sixkiller.com. And is your contact information on there, I assume?
Right, and feel free to write me. And if you have any questions after you read the book, feel free. I answer all the emails unless somebody
That's great. Oh,
unless it's just a net. And interestingly enough, most people that write to me are very, very interested in what I'm writing about. It's been a very positive experience for me, and I appreciate that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining the show tonight, and you're such an inspiration to everyone, and thank you for getting out that important information to the public, because I think it's important right now with the world the way it is. We need to hear the truth out there, so thank you so much. And
you're so welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners out there. This concludes the show for tonight, and many blessings to all of you, and keep those rainbow visions in your heart. Bye, everybody, and thanks again, Dr. Clarke.
You're sure welcome.
Bye-bye.